Hi everyone, I'm Tom Lynch, and I wanted to take a few minutes to share with you a particular approach to kind of thinking about literacy that I've been using with some different schools that I've been working with. Um, and it's challenging, it's tricky, right? Because we think about literacy in terms of often reading, unfortunately. That's kind of what gets tested a lot. That's what, especially with schools that are struggling with communities of students who are really struggling, like that tends to be what we end up focusing on is like literacy, and then literacy gets kind of translated as like reading. But the problem with that is like that's not really what the research says like literacy is. That isn't, and in fact, if students are struggling with reading, then just focusing on reading isn't necessarily the best or only way to go about it. And in fact, what we know is that reading and writing, speaking and listening are really, really intertwined. So the challenge for schools who are under, let's say, pressure to get up test scores, which are heavily like focused on kind of reading based literacy levels, and then also some kind of on demand writing, like the challenge is like how do you think about your curriculum and your unit planning with without sort of distilling it into kind of an overly simplistic model, and it's really really hard. And I like to say that like teaching to the test isn't always just like putting scantrons and multiple choice questions in front of students. Sometimes teaching to the test means like we treat things like literacy, what it means to read, as like really kind of unimaginative and rote, and in this case separated from writing. So all of that to say, like, if you're at a school and you're working with pre-existing curriculum, or you have some flexibility to make some changes, but you've got maybe an inexperienced teaching staff, like what do you do, right? Like how do you handle some of this? So here's a suggestion. So one of the things you do is what I call this inversive literacy model. So with an inversive literacy model, all that really means, it just means that it's trying to take into account like the reading and the writing components, and kind of thinking about them strategically. So what you'll see is like down here, we've got the weeks, right, of a given unit. So that's the time of study. Then over here, you'll see that we've got the kind of, there we go, there's like the writing line, and there's the reading line there. So the idea is that like at the, in the beginning of a given unit, you pose essential questions, right, which are here. And you also, you have in mind like a final product, like whatever your final assessment is going to be, right? But you start the unit with this essential question in mind, and the real focus initially is on the what. It's like, what do these texts say about a topic? And for the first week, 2.5 weeks, you're really just working with the students on getting exposed to as many texts as possible that are just interesting to them, to the students, and also that deal with whatever that essential question is. And those texts should be of multiple of genres and multiple modes. Like, so it's like video and audio and written, literary, informational, the whole, everything you can just, if it's interesting, if it'll engage the students, if it deals with a topic, you create different opportunities for them to engage. Then as you start to get into this kind of middle part of the unit here, you start to kind of pivot and you start to think more about, for about a week, you start to think more about the how, the craft of the texts, right? Now, when you start to focus on the how, you're actually starting to read like a writer, right? Or you're reading like a composer, right? And so you should be doing that too with the final product in mind. So if the final product is like an op-ed, for example, then this is where you're starting to look at op-eds really closely, and you're starting to say like, what makes an op-ed an op-ed? Let's look at some examples. What makes a great introductory sentence? What makes a great conclusionary sentence? But you're making this sort of move from talking about the concepts, the ideas, the big stuff, which is what can often excite and interest students. You start to make this move into looking at like the craft of composing, or in most cases it's in writing. And then as you spend after about a week on that, then you move into this kind of this focus on the writing process that's leading up to this final product. So if you are, let's say, in a unit where you're studying op-eds, then you would be spending quite a bit of time with giving students some space to like draft some op-eds, get some feedback from each other, from the teacher. And then, go back and rewrite it, show it again, look at examples of texts on the board with students, have an example of a text and be like, this is an opening line from an op-ed. Let's see if we can rewrite it 3 different ways and who can rewrite it best, right? Looking at an op-ed and saying, like, what's the worst line in this op-ed? What makes a terrible line a terrible line? And have those conversations about craft, both kind of in the middle of the unit and then also when students are engaging in the writing process. Use some of those same methods as a way to raise students' awareness of their own writing. And that's it at like kind of the gist of it. I call it the inversive model because like reading and writing kind of do this like crisscross. That wasn't it, like a crisscross right throughout. It's certainly not the only way to go about it, but I have found in a few different schools at this point that when teachers are trying to rethink how they're going about their literacy practices and they're looking for just kind of a framework that does more to integrate reading and writing, this has been a helpful way for some to go about that work.